welcome. I think we're going to start. Good afternoon. Welcome back to everyone. Bon après-midi. Buenas tardes. We'd like to start again. We're running a little bit late, but we feel there's a lot of energy in the room. Hopefully after some good discussions the past 2 days, hopefully after a good lunch, some good side events. So now we'd like to go into our first plenary session this afternoon, where we're doing a report back from the working sessions that we've had the past 2 days. And so on this panel, we'll have some of the rapporteurs from the key sessions, as well as Ambassador Eva Åkerman Börje, the head of the secretariat of the GFMD Swedish Chairmanship, who will also be speaking at the end and listening to our reports the whole time. So we're very honored that you could also be on the panel with us, Eva. So I'd like to ask our rapporteurs to make their reports. So the idea of this session is that all of us who have been participating can also get an idea of what the themes were from the other sessions. This session is not necessarily to go in depth on the findings from these reports. These reports they will, when the rapporteurs are speaking, they'll actually be showing you on the screen what the reporting template is. There's also photocopies on the table over here for your reference if you'd like to have that. We will have some time for interaction with the floor. But the idea is that this session is for you to be informed about what were the key points in the other sessions. It's not to rediscuss the whole sessions again. So with that, I'd like to begin with our first session, the session on labor, labor recruitment, labor migration. And I'd like to ask Philip Hunter, who's the program director from Verité, to give us the key findings from this session. So thank you, Philip.
Sure, thank you. So I had the pleasure of being co-rapporteur for this first session on shaping goals for labor mobility, labor rights, and decent work. And it was divided into the two sessions, one on guaranteeing decent work, social protection for migrants, and the second from this morning on improving migrant labor recruitment, placement, and employment practices. I'll try to keep my comments brief, but we did have a very engaging and lengthy discussion over the course of the 2 days, wherein it seemed there was quite a good deal of consensus, which was very encouraging. I've divided up my comments according to the key themes or topics that we were asked to use in our report back. So I'll report briefly on progress, some recommendations for change, changes on the ground or the needed practices and tools, and then some targets and indicators. On progress, very briefly, quite a number of speakers from both the panels and the floor commented on new collaboration and dialogue, new partnerships and cooperation, not only within civil society, but between NGOs and unions, between civil society and governments, some within a multi-stakeholder context also involving business. Out of that collaboration, new strategies and tools, new campaigns, new sets of principles addressing migration, addressing fair recruitment have emerged, and a number of specific tools were referenced as well, which is very encouraging. Also new international instruments that have been adopted in recent years. For example, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were referenced during this morning's discussion as an important tool that could be used in the context of the GFMD and in all of our work to engage business. Some of that discussion also focused on some progress on public procurement, for example, and labor practices in global supply chains. Finally, progress was or has been made, or people felt that progress had been made, some progress had been made in engaging with the private sector, though there are many steps still needed to be taken. That brings me to recommendations for change. I've sort of divided this up into 4 various categories: the role of states, private sector, broader cooperation, and research. Some recommendations that came for the role of states, of course, things we've probably all discussed over the last few days on ratification of international instruments, their translation into strong national laws, and very strongly a feeling was that effective enforcement and implementation was an absolutely necessary next step. One thing that came out in both of our sessions was the role of municipal authorities, the role of cities, the role that they can play in this action and engagement as well. Rights-based trade agreements also came up. So using existing trade agreements, side agreements to trade agreements, for example, in the North American context, is also something that we could do more of. And then policy coherence across different ministries and municipal jurisdictions as well. And then very strongly today was the political will was essential in making these changes. The private sector. I mentioned that some progress had been made, but clearly not enough had been done so far in this space, that we needed as civil society to find new and better ways to engage with business, but more importantly, companies themselves need better policies, need due diligence, need effective assessment systems, and need to be addressing the vulnerabilities of migrant workers, for example, in supply chains. And that this applies both to recruitment actors themselves, but also the broader private sector. For example, multinational corporations, but then also the employers within supply chains that are engaging actors within the recruitment industry. Although it had been recognized that there was a great deal more dialogue and cooperation across civil society, the general sentiment was that we need more and better cooperation between NGOs and unions themselves, but then also with other stakeholders, including obviously governments. And then finally, research. There is a real need for more research specific to migration and recruitment, more data on various data points related to migration and recruitment, and then knowledge sharing, information systems that can share that knowledge publicly. Some changes on the ground or some needed practices, partnerships and tools. One thing that was noted in our conversations from those participants from the Gulf region and Middle East was that there has been quite a significant shift in tone from the media, for example, in the way that they cover migration and migrants' rights. Something very specific to those regions where this system is in place was the necessity to abolish the kafala system. And where that is abolished, then to ensure that there's subsequent monitoring to ensure that where it is legally then abolished, that in fact in practice it is as well. One thing that came out of this morning's discussion on recruitment was the need for tools to blacklist, for example, recruitment agencies and employers that have been identified as using coercive or abusive practices. And then another very key measure, special legal procedures to enable redress for migrant workers who have faced such abuse, both in countries of origin and in countries of destination. That brings me to the last point, and that is on targets and indicators. Again, we came very strongly to this concept of political will, the political will to ratify international instruments, the political will to translate those into national laws, and to ensure their enforcement and implementation. The specific topics addressed in the initial session yesterday were focused on forced labor and domestic workers. New research and information systems on migration and recruitment, comprehensive data on migrant workers, progress on the portability of rights in all social protection areas, health and education and others were specifically referenced, but progress in all social protection areas. Then also the policy recognition on the role of labor unions, both nationally and internationally, is essential. And finally, a key point was made about the reduction of wage differentials across origin and destination countries in order to reduce the need to migrate in the first place. So those are some of the targets and indicators that were identified. This is by no means everything that was discussed over our 2 days, but I hope that I've managed to summarize it reasonably well enough. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Philip. As you said, I think you've given a clear indication of some of the key points. The rest are there and also in your document. But I think that there's some points that will most likely also be relevant from the other sessions. Implementation. So we need to first move towards ratification of relevant instruments, adoption of instruments, but especially implementation. Political will. That's seen as a really crucial point for labor, but other issues as well. Better cooperation, research, and particularly for labor, the kafala system, which one participant also said is not endemic to certain regions. We have some of that in Europe as well. So I think the one point that I did want to mention is there was a recommendation about the ILO Forced Labor Convention 29 for a push to encourage governments to come up with a protocol. This will be discussed in June. And I would ask maybe Sophie or someone from the technical, there's a slide where we've had here on the PowerPoint a website that I believe the unions or NGOs have launched, a campaign to also encourage people to sign a petition to encourage governments to come up with a protocol. I don't know with Sophie or Bjorn or someone from the organizers if it's possible to show this slide. Yes, it's here. So you can see the website, hopefully. It's a push to really bring a lot of people on board to have a lot of discussion about this. I don't know, Philip, if you want to say anything more about that.
Yeah, the key was really to encourage governments to support this new protocol, which is a protocol to Convention 29, from the ILO, which I'm sure you all know is from 1930. It's quite old and yet still quite relevant. The point of the protocol, though, is to provide some updating of that and to support it. I think it's an ITUC campaign, a union and NGO campaign to encourage our respective governments to support that protocol and the discussions towards that protocol at the International Labour Conference beginning in June.
Thank you very much. Yes, please visit the website. Please have some discussion on how to also get more signatories to this particular initiative. I'd like to move on now to the other sessions. So the name of the session is Protecting and Empowering Migrants in Distress in Transit, at Borders and in Detention. So they have covered a huge amount of themes. We also have a sub-session on children. So our two rapporteurs from that session, I think, will divide. I'd like to ask Sanjula first. So Sanjula Weerasinghe. Sorry, Sanjula, I know you by your first name, but not your last name, so I don't hope that that's been incorrect. A research associate on Georgetown University who's also written a lot on this particular issue and is the rapporteur for that session, so I'd like to welcome you.
Thank you, Michelle. It's Sanjula Weerasinghe, and it's Sri Lankan, and it's very hard to pronounce, so I never really introduced myself by the second name, so I forgive you for not being able to say it at all. As Michelle said, our session was on protecting migrants and families, and it was divided into two subsections. The first subsection on protecting and empowering migrants in distress, in transit, at borders and in detention, and my co-rapporteur Milka will present on the second session, which was on protecting children. I'm going to try and tell you about three broad themes that came up throughout the session, acknowledging that it was 3 hours of discussion and I'm not going to be able to synthesize everything that was covered during that session. Within those three broad themes, I'm going to actually try and discuss the progress that was made, the change that was recommended, and give you a sense of an indicator that came up under each, rather than taking you through each of the 4 components of the template that is up there. So the first theme was, the first area in which progress had been made was related to the increased attention and convergence between governments and civil society on the need to address the situation of migrants who are caught in difficult situations. But there was an acknowledgement that there was lack of harmony in the terminology that was being used by different groups. So terms such as migrants in crisis, migrants in transit, migrants stranded in distress, and stranded migrants are being used by different actors, and those terms mean different things to different people. It seems that some governments are beginning a discussion on trying to come up with a protection framework for migrants who might be caught in situations of conflict and natural disasters. And the civil society participants in our group acknowledged that that was real progress. In terms of a change then on that theme, civil society also felt that there was a need to address the situation of migrants who are caught in other types of difficult situations. For example, those that may be dying, disappearing, or experiencing severe physical abuse in transit or in destination countries. And a way to monitor that change would be for governments and civil society to work together to monitor deaths, disappearance, and physical abuse in transit and destination. And an indicator of that would be the creation of such mechanisms and the increase in monitoring reports on those issues. So that was the broad theme that was discussed first. The second broad theme that came up and where progress had been made related to migrants in irregular situations. It was acknowledged that states are increasingly criminalising migrants in irregular situations, but that progress had been made in exploring, developing and piloting alternatives to detention and other good practices for particularly vulnerable populations, including women, children, victims of trafficking and torture. And in addition, that some states had adopted laws to provide access to fundamental services such as health and education for irregular migrants, so regardless of their legal status. A recommendation or change in regards to the criminalisation of irregular migrants was for civil society to advocate for states to position the human dignity of migrants at the forefront of migration management policies, and for civil society to campaign for states to create more channels for regular migration and to create targeted mechanisms for the regularisation of irregular migrants. Another change in that respect was for civil society to advocate for states to ensure access to services and access to justice, including through due process guarantees for migrants who are in transit, in distress, and regardless of their legal status. In terms of an indicator then on that, was the increase in national legislation that addressed the provision of services to migrants regardless of status, and the repeal of any national legislation that might criminalise services to migrants on the basis of status, as well as the increase in regularisation mechanisms and the increase in new channels of regular migration. So that was the second theme. And then the last theme was the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights had begun an initiative through an expert consultation to develop voluntary principles and recommendations on the human rights of migrants at borders, and these had been derived from international human rights law. It's intended to serve states and other actors to better understand their obligations towards migrants and the rights of migrants who are at borders, and this was regarded as real progress in looking at the situation of migrants at borders. A recommendation in relation to that area was for the principles and guidelines for the protection of migrants at international borders to be used as a tool by states and other actors, including through the provision of training for national actors, judicial bodies, and other civil society actors working on protecting migrants at borders. And one indicator in that respect was to monitor and document the number of trainings that are occurring in that regard. Now again, those are the three broad themes. The first on migrants in difficult situations, regardless of the terminology being used, so in transit, caught in war, caught in conflict, disappearing or dying. The second theme was on the criminalisation of irregular migrants and how to address that situation. And the third area was addressing the human rights of migrants at borders.
Thank you very much, Sanjula. I think this is also nice because this year, in particular, we've been asked to look at indicators. So I think the three areas that you've just presented with also showing what the issue is, what are the recommendations, and what are the indicators, is also helpful in trying to move into this framework where we kind of break this down into different steps. So that's very useful. I think it's also interesting that you mentioned at the beginning that there's increased convergence between civil societies and governments on addressing migrants in different situations of crisis, because this is what Philip had also said, that there's also increased convergence among society as well as governments on the issue of the urgency of looking at situations of labor. But what's interesting here is that you said there's a lack of harmony in terminology to address this. So this is one of the things, and I think that as a starting point is also very useful to see how then we build on this convergence, but then also show that the issue is much broader than migrants in countries of crisis. Thank you. We'll now move on to the co-chair for that very long titled session and ask Milka Asinta, who is the chair of the Pan-African Network in Defense of Migrants' Rights, to report back on the session that looked at children.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to be a little bit brief, but straight to the point in regards to our second working session, which was on protecting and empowering children in the context of migration. First, in terms of progress made, we realized that in the recent years we've been having understanding on the breadth and scale of children in the migration flow. This issue has not been in discussion in the past GFMD up to last year, and this is one of the progress that has been made, and attention has been put on empowering children and protecting them, including their rights, during the migration processes, and also addressing the root causes to assistance, protection in transit and upon arrival, and through other durable solutions. Some of the increasing interest is evidenced amongst other things. We had 3 issues that were raised in this point, which included the UN Committee on the Rights of Children dedicated a day at the general discussion in 2012 to the rights of all children in the context of international migration, and ensuring the 35 recommendations which are actually available, and copies can be made to all of us. There is also a specific mention which was done at the higher level dialogue, both through by the civil society and the UN member states, that highlighted the need to protect the human rights of migrant children and ensure the best interest of the child as a primary consideration in regards to return and reintegration, also in regards to family reunification. And the third bit of the fast was also the high-level panel in the recent Human Rights Council session, mainstreaming on human rights mainstreaming, paying some attention to the children in the context of migration. The other area that we realized had progress was also greater attention being placed on the need to eliminate detention of children and to implement alternatives to detention. And this we felt would be done through advocacy campaigns and calling to the end of immigration detentions of children. There was one specific participant who raised the issue that before September 11th, there never used to be detention camps, but how come they're there right now, and what was happening there before actually could be replicated and continued in regards to children. And the third area of progress was that we realized that we have many young people organizing themselves as migrants and being given opportunities to speak for themselves. We also realized in our session that children can speak for themselves. We don't have to talk on their behalf, and through speaking for themselves, they can actually be empowered. For example, we have a group in the US called United We Dream, Together We Act. There is actually a website there that you can download and get information, where we have these young people, the youth, who have been able to come together and they have raised funds to support themselves, and also to assist other youth who have been educated in the US to get a path to work permits, and protecting them against this, deportation. This is actually one of the areas there's good progress. And also with respect to youth empowerment, we were informed that there's some 6 children who had been detained, and they were allowed to go to a UN committee meeting, and they were able to express and speak for themselves on the experiences they had during detention, and actually advocate against children being detained. And then the fourth issue of progress is that we've realized there's a movement at the international level to look at the needs of children in a more holistic manner, and not to just focus on children who have been trafficked. And all of it is actually on the children on the move, and which the issue of being trafficked is actually a sold approach which needs to be changed, and specific categories of migrant children, understanding their needs and more generously, so that those who fall to such categories such as trafficking and asylum seekers are able to assess protection. On recommendations in regards to policies and practices, we also had 4 of them. The first was on focusing on specific categories of children that require protection, such as children who have been trafficked, and also there's a need to broaden this lens and focus on their protection in context of mobility as a whole, not just specifically trafficked children. Also, the need for social protections in countries of origin as a means of addressing root causes. As more often we keep on discussing about the migration process, we forget that one of the main issues that causes migration is actually the root causes of migration in the origin countries, which need to be addressed by the states. And also the right to education, health, and also birth registration. We know that in some countries we have a state of statelessness for children, which should not be the case, and this is one of the issues that need to be put in place in change in terms of policies and practices. The third one is continuing building on momentum on ending immigration detention for children and also access of justice for migrant children at national and regional levels, which includes representation at legal proceedings. For instance, those who are in both the transit and destination countries, giving them information on their basic rights and the best practice principle. Also, creation of independent monitoring bodies on the rights of these children. On the third bit on the change of the ground, we realized that the first one actually is the 35 recommendation which I raised, that we need to go through that document and see that it is applicable in our home countries and countries of destinations, also including children who are as young as 7 and between 7 to 9 years being used as interpreters, which of their parents in various harmful situations, even in terms of sensitive health issues, which is a practice that should be stopped. And then the third one is that there should be action undertaken on educating and capacity building, specifically to teachers and other educators, to understand the signs of trafficked children, know their rights, and provide them the required basic services, and also for them to know the kind of available services that are there so that they can actually use them. And the fourth was on the civil society to assist and support creation of youth movements, for example, the DREAM one, which I mentioned earlier on, to advocate to have the children and the youths to be able to speak on their own voices, and then better data collection mechanisms on migrant children, because this is the basis we can actually use to continue pursuing policy change. Then on the targets and indicators, we had, I think, 3 of them. One of them is that we need to know the number of countries that have submitted the reports on the Committee of Rights of the Children and other treaty bodies that include attention to each of the 4 recommendations earlier, and also monitor resources used to address protection of children in the context of migration and disintegrate them by different demographic indicators. The third one is actually to make progress to increase the number of countries that have adopted policies and best practices of children determination through the different phases of the migratory process, and also to ensure to find out the number of countries that are actually giving access to basic services for undocumented children within their borders. And then the last but on the list is to monitor progress on implementation of laws and policies that end immigration detention of children and provide alternatives to detention of children, and also monitor the practices. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Milka. I think for being maybe only the second time in the Civil Society Days that we've looked at children, I think you've mapped out probably the whole issue. So, no, I mean, that was very comprehensive, and I think it's important to remember what you mentioned at the beginning, what was the starting point for a lot of your discussions, were how was civil society, especially as well as UN institutions, governments, trying to put this issue on the agenda, and where were some of the places? And I think the cornerstone is what you mentioned at the beginning and at the end, the UN's Committee on the Rights of the Child, Day of General Discussion, 2012 report. For those not familiar with it, this is the most comprehensive and up-to-date document that we have looking at children in the context of migration from a rights-based approach. And you mentioned it has 35 recommendations. And so this document is really a basis for both civil society and governments to work on concerning children in the context of migration. And I also want to make a point about that terminology, because you also had as one of your issues focusing on children in a holistic manner. And this is now the terminology that many of us are using, because children in the context of migration looks at all children. So it looks at children in countries of origin whose parents might be migrating. It looks at children in transit or destination who might be migrant children, as well as children in those countries in transit and destination who are born there but to migrant parents, so who are not migrant children. So when we look at this issue, we should also think, how can we look at this in the most comprehensive way and also use terms that also speak to this whole issue concerning children and the child rights framework. So thank you very much, Milka. I'd like to go on to now the session called Shaping Goals for the Empowerment of Migrants and Communities for Social Inclusion and Human Development, and ask Rafael Samanes, the Executive Director of Vamos Unidos, very much like, I've always liked the name of your organization, to give us a report back from that session.
Sure. So I will try to go through each of the 4 points that we covered, that we chose to try to cover as much of the conversation that was done in these 2 days. Very lively conversation, very fruitful. So under progress, the first point was positive, sustainable relationships have been created with local governments, entities in parallel with international efforts to ensure change. And that was said a couple of times, that although there has been a lot of international efforts, that we needed to concentrate on local efforts with governments in order to push this agenda. Another progress, number 2, is access to quality service, social protections, and comprehensive integrated access to rights-based, gender-responsive information. The example that was given was that migrants should have the support and opportunity, for example, to review contracts before committing to work. And the information should cover the entire migration process or cycle, pre-departure, on-site, residence, return, and reintegration. Number 3, diaspora are more aware of the role they play in job creation. And number 4 is establish links between professional in sending and receiving countries in order to increase knowledge and expertise in countries of origin. Recommendations for changes in policies and practices. Point number 1 is migrant workers' qualifications and job experiences gained in the receiving countries need to be recognized by the countries of origin to ensure continuations of careers when they return. Number 2, diaspora's role should not replace the state's responsibility of ensuring proper socioeconomic conditions. 3, create adequate policy frameworks and mechanisms in both sending and receiving countries to maximize contribution of diaspora to development. Number 4 is support job development policies that lead to employment that is decent and fair, and challenge the idea that greater flows of remittances will lead to development. Inspiring practices and partnerships and tools that were mentioned, we're creating social dialogue networks between to increase participation and coordination to address issues with government. Public education to improve perception of returning migrants as contributing members of society. Number 3, lobby focused on inclusive policies between integration and development to build stronger migrant communities that can contribute more to development in countries of origin. Number 4, organization of diaspora at the local, national, and international levels are necessary to ensure inclusion in the post-2015 agenda. Some of the targets and indicators is create observatory to collect data to measure the true impact of migrants and their contributions, including the positive and negative impact on the sending and receiving countries. Something that was mentioned as well in there was ad hoc efforts are good, but should be in addition to a centralized system. Number 2 is creation of jobs that are decent and fair through development policies will be a measuring factor that this is functioning well. Number 3, migrant rights and diaspora sectors need to work together to transform public policies in both sending and receiving countries. The overemphasis by corporations and governments on remittances as a primary solution to these social problems need to be challenged. Diaspora and migrant rights organizations need to work together to advocate for better policies that place responsibility on governments and corporations, not the migrants. And number 4, countries of origin should strive to decrease remittances as an essential factor for development. One of the quotes that we heard was, if you think you're too small to make a change, you've never been in a room with a mosquito. And the second session, I think we can look at the title on the screen because I don't have it on my paper, but Some of the progress that was made around this issue, is the title on the screen? No. Just gonna, yeah, facilitating migrant and diaspora organizations as transnational social investors and policy advocates for access to services and public policy changes. So under that theme, the progress that was spoken about, and then point number 1 is create a capacity for the diaspora to identify opportunities to increase impact. That was said a couple of times, so we put it as number 1. Number 2 is passage of deferred action for childhood arrivals, also known as DACA, in the U.S. as an example of policies to prevent deportation of undocumented migrant youth. And our organization has felt the impact of positive impact of that right away, as I believe almost 56 of our youth have been able to get documents, Social Security, and be able to work, and thus have the time and ability to focus on how to help the community, including the efforts that we have spoken about before. Number 3, create more regional and transnational migrants and diaspora networks and campaigns. Number 4, examples of local authorities implementing municipal ID cards for documented and undocumented migrants to access financial and social services, such as the consular identification cards. Recommendations, number 1, the creation of a platform to share experiences and resources while building a movement that is multi-sectoral and includes local governments, civil society, media, academics, and private sector. Number 2, commitment to support efforts to increase the work skills, capacity, job opportunities, and creations of networks of migrant women while ensuring that they can access work at every level. And it was said that not just low-level jobs or wage jobs, but also high wage jobs as well. Replicate models of local migrants' rights policy victories by building organizing capacity and skills by using a thematic focus. And number 4, garnishing knowledge about the diaspora and local home countries to inform and lead people-centered development policies. And some of the inspiring practices that we saw on this issue was, number 1, training of future generations of migrants and diaspora youth in diaspora to be leaders and agents of change. A shift away from the dominant development paradigm and advancing social investment as a driving factor. That was said a couple of times. Number 3, multi-generational training to develop life, work skills, and build transnational space. Number 4, utilizing social media to influence governments of origin to recognize the contribution of migrant communities in countries of origin and destination. Some targets and indicators. Number 1 is national policies that shift away from circular migration and allow permanent resident and social inclusion. Number 2, migrant communities are recognized as citizens of both the country of origins and residence. 3, training and capacity building initiatives for diaspora groups to better collaborate and engage in comprehensive efforts to design and elaborate public policy and enable political participation. And some of the quotes were, knowledge is not only to be found in the West, and expose the important links between human rights and diaspora development. Yes.
Thank you very much, Rafael. I think that you've had some strong messages coming out. One of them, I think, is diaspora roles should not replace states' responsibilities, and also a call for diaspora organizations and migrants' rights organizations to work more together, to strategize more together to tackle this issue of overemphasis on states relying on remittances as a solution to the problem. So I think that the call for more convergence here is one that we need to also pay attention to. And I think that there's also some themes that you've mentioned that also have come up in some of the other reports, such as empowerment, and particularly of youth, because that was actually mentioned in the report that Milka gave back. The call to collect more data, and also political participation. I don't know if I heard it here, but I know I've heard it in some of the sessions, just being in some of the sessions. and especially the local level. I think that's come up quite a bit in yours, and it's come up quite a bit in some of the other ones, the importance of working with city, regional authorities, so the examples that you gave of some of the, even undocumented, giving particular ID cards or some kind of recognition. So those are all really crucial. Thank you. I'd like to now go to Colin Rajah, the coordinator of the Global Coalition on Migration, who will give a report back on the infamous green room, the post-2015 discussion. So Colin would like to, and this one was also during the lunch break, so this was also an intense working session for those who were having their lunch in this infamous green room. So Colin, would you like to give a report back, please?
Thanks, Michelle. The green room, people took the green room really seriously. On the first day, we had people wearing green ties and green dresses. Someone even with green shoes. She knows who she is. Just to kind of set the stage on how much work has gone into this, even this week, something like 17 or 18 hours, our rough guesstimate on number of hours just since Friday, and countless more hours, countless more hours before this week gone into this work, and much more to come. The idea here is to submit to this week's GFMD first a short text, so-called chapeau, a preamble, if you will, that outlines the basic parameters in terms of how we think the discussion around migration post-2015 development agenda should be, and some key points related to that. And attached to that, a set of goals and targets. And then later on, we'll have to work on indicators as well. Next week, at least. 3 things, just a quick reference and comments. Not just migration in the post-2015 development agenda, but migrants and migration in the post-2015 development agenda. Not just 2015, but the 15 years beyond that into the next set of SDGs. And finally, not just a global development agenda, but a development agenda with national implications as well. So looking also at national agendas and how we have impact on that. So having said that, the chapeau. The language for the chapeau is lifted directly out of the talking points and key messages coming out of this past weekend's People's Global Action on Migration, Development, and Human Rights, or PGA. So we'll just kind of breeze through the key ideas around that and not get stuck on the exact language, as that continues to be tweaked and changed and redrafted and made much more effective in how we communicate this. But just as a start, generally looking at the development paradigm in and of itself, and stating here that the dominant development paradigm actually produces in and of itself inequities, and those inequities then compel migration. So just a critique on the development paradigm that's currently the dominant global economic paradigm. And the call to move towards more people and nature-centered, especially rights-based development models with corporate accountabilities attached to that. And to underline again, many times highlighting from the high-level dialogue statement, summary, Chairman's summary as well, migration should be a choice, not a necessity. And within that, some 3 general areas to look at specifically. Firstly, national and international laws and obligations should guarantee decent work for all, and a huge bold and underline on all, including migrant workers regardless of status in countries of origin and destination. And the underline under all is to identify that this implies citizens, non-citizens, in home countries, countries of transit, countries of destination, across the board. Second point, states should pursue robust and comprehensive social protection policies in critical areas of community well-being, with a few examples like education, healthcare, housing, and many more were mentioned through indicators and targets in multiple documents. And then thirdly, a point about migrant remittances, that migrant remittances are neither an answer to development, nor really a good or appropriate policy to reduce poverty. And there's some questions about this that I'll come back to in a second. So attached to this chapeau that I just outlined, a set of targets and goals. We didn't get to the indicators yet. Our work ahead of us, but targets and goals. 2 broad targets and 9 goals related under that. You have a draft of this in your packet, the blue document. First target, under goals similar to the MDGs that can be drawn out from a number of ongoing processes, such as the Eminent Persons Panel, convened by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the Member States Open-Ended Working Group, which actually just had its last meeting, or the most recent meeting, just last week, ending on Friday. The second target, looking at a standalone goal. I'll come back to that in a second. But under the first target, 8 goals. The first goal around creating jobs, sustainable livelihoods, and equitable growth. Under here, reference towards decent work and everything that framework entails, the decent work opportunities in countries of origin, which then again, the same statement, to prevent migration being, to make migration an option and prevent it being a necessity. Reference also to decent working conditions and social protections, again, that conform to international human rights and labor standards, and also reference to ensuring the portability of skills and benefits, and all of those that kind of fall under that, including social security, pensions, and the like. Second goal, about ending poverty. 2 points under here, reducing, or in many cases, it's possible, limiting the cost of sending remittances, and then protecting and promoting the private use of remittances for family and community development. Family and community development. Third goal, empowering girls and women and trying to achieve gender equality. Here, kind of reference to social and legal protection for migrant women and girls, and then also special mention of migrant domestic workers. Goal number 4, providing quality education and lifelong learning. Enough said there. Goal number 5, ensuring healthy lives, and again, specific mention towards access to adequate and quality healthcare for all migrants. Again, all migrants, regardless of status. Goal number 6, ensuring good governance and effective institutions. Here, special reference to access to justice and due process, ending policies and programs that criminalize and detain migrants, increasing participation and contributions of migrants in public policy planning and implementation, and calling on states to ratify, implement core UN and ILO instruments related to this. Goal number 7, to ensure stable and peaceful societies, and under here, looking at cultural, social, and economic contributions and creating more public awareness around that from migrants and diaspora, and institutionalizing mechanisms that embrace and integrate migrants into all countries, origin, heritage, and destination. And then finally, the 8th goal under this target, to create a global enabling environment for development with new partnerships. And under partnerships, ensuring that migrants and diaspora are engaged as partners, important stakeholders in development, and promoting collaboration and access to migration development data. And then a mention about the standalone goal, and under that target, 3 key points to enlarge human security and human development benefits of migration. So 3 key points under that. To prevent and address human trafficking and violence against migrants, to improve systemic responses to forced migration, and to reduce inefficiencies that basically create the lack of proper documentation. This is what's been captured so far. In terms of what we discussed yesterday in the green room, in the drop-in green room, and again today in the lunchtime breakout green room, some key points and feedback, inputs, recommendations into tweaks and changes on both documents, on both the chapeau language as well as the blueprint. On the chapeau, a reference to global governance and the lack of effective institutions and the lack of policy coherence, basically drawing it in line with one of the points in the blueprint document. A question about making some of the language more familiar with governments, more familiar to governments, language already being used by governments. So some tweaks and changes there. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the third point in the chapeau around migrant remittances. A huge question that existed in our discussions and debates, whether migrant remittances actually contribute towards the development, actually has an impact or not, and maybe some clarification on what it means, whether it's community development, whether it's family development, or whether it's a national policy development that we're talking about here. So we need to clarify that. On the blue document, two general recommendations and comments. One, not to call it a blueprint yet. We're not there yet. Because of the changes and the tweaks, the redrafting, the additions, the extractions that continue to go to it, it's a living document. So for this week at least, not yet to call it a blueprint, again, from a purely tactical level, that as we take it to the governments, that the governments don't think that this is a final blueprint, so to speak. Second, in goal number 1, not just the eminent persons panel, not just the OWG or open-ended working group, but just 2 weeks ago, the meeting in Dakar and the recommendations that came out from the global experts meeting related to that. So looking at that document and those set of recommendations and trying to relate to that as well. So those two general recommendations in terms of the whole document. Specific recommendations. Under goal number 2, in terms of ending poverty, a notation that the only 2 points under ending poverty relate to remittances, and that we should actually look at other areas, not just remittances. A point that not just violence against migrants, but also a specific mention about violence against women should be indicated here. A long discussion, specific mention about FGMs, female genital mutilation, should go into here as well. Another mention also not just about portability of skills and benefits, but portability of rights. So maybe an extension there under that. A point that we should attach to here, an additional goal or an additional bullet point relating to children. So not just in terms of education, where we have a point already, but something more specific and perhaps drawing out from some of the work that Milka talked about. A point about recruitment costs and practice, that should also be indicated here. And then finally, a point about states' accountability in migrants in crisis, and again here maybe drawing on some of the work that the breakout group that Sanjula reported on did. So these are recommendations that came out in the green room yesterday and today. We also have an ongoing list in terms of strategy discussions. How do we take this forward? Some of it already talked about in terms of language, maybe tweaking the language for tactical purposes in how we submit this in different forms. And then we have a whole other list of looking at other good practices in terms of strategies, how other movements have accomplished this on an international, intergovernmental level. And we'll have an ongoing discussion about that, but we just wanted to report back on the substance so far. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Colin. I think that was very comprehensive, and I think the effort of going into detail was that these are also processes that civil society organizations have contributed to for many months already. The blue document, the discussions this weekend at the People's Global Action, also on the post-2015. So I think it's important, as you say, that this is also seen as part of a process, a work and a conversation in progress. But also, this is also what groups all of this together, this post-2015 discussion, all of the inputs that we've heard so far, so it's really important also for our framing. So I'd now like to ask our special guest, Eva Åkerman Börje, who's been patiently listening for the past hour to all of these report backs, to invite you in your role with the Swedish chair of the GFMD to reflect on what you've heard so far and how you also see this discussion going into the common space. And if you'd like to do that from here or from there, whichever you feel most comfortable with.
I think I'll
Okay.
stand up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you very, very much. I'm, for those of you who meet me for the first time, I'm Eva Åkerman Börje. I'm a Swedish civil servant that has been engaged in this debate on migration and development for the past 10 to 15 years or so. And I'm now the chair of the Global Forum representing my country. I would like to begin by starting off thanking you all for the opportunity to come here and listen to all these reports back. I mean, I'm overwhelmed by all the interesting ideas and recommendations that are put forward by you, and I must say that I already feel very energized by what has been said here today. I've also had the opportunity of being here for several of the events that took place yesterday and today to listen and speak to you. And when I sat here listening to the reports back from the breakouts, there were several thoughts that came to my mind, of course. The first one, though, is that I'm really so very happy to be part of this process that has really blossomed into a genuine global dialogue about migration over the past 6-7 years. The fact that we can be here together today to have this conversation, and this week to be here together, is a testament, I think, to the commitment of civil society organizations to prioritize, engage, and advocate on migration-related issues, not in opposition to, but as partners with governments over the long term. There are no quick fixes on migration. There are many factors involved, not least the free will of migrants themselves to make choices that they hope will improve their lives and the life of their loved ones. The challenge that we face are as a result of the different starting points and perspectives that we all have. I believe that we have learned to respect that, and that it is one of the reasons we have seen progress within the GFMD process. So the second thought that struck me was how much our core goals of civil society and those of governments are aligned. And we've heard the word convergence being repeated here in the reports back. And I would like to spend a few minutes to explain what I mean by that. Let me start by voicing my appreciation for the fact that Civil Society Days have so clearly taken its starting point in the inclusion of migration in the post-2015 development agenda, the work of the Green Room and all the sessions. This is also, as you know, the key priority of the government meeting of the GFMD to come. As has already been so eloquently stated, this is needed in order to promote international partnerships and policies that facilitate safe and orderly and regular migration. It is also a necessary element of our joint goals to reduce the costs and increase the productivity for migrants themselves, as well as countries of origin and countries of destination. You have highlighted the importance of recognizing migrants and diaspora as agents of development, ensuring decent work and avoiding violation of migrants' rights. These issues feature regularly in the government deliberations on migration in the post-2015 development agenda. Other issues that come up time and time again are reducing the costs of recruitment and remittances, allowing migrants access to social security benefits that they have earned even as they move, and ensuring proper recognition of the skills that they bring. Let me go into a little bit more of detail on some of the points that you have highlighted over the last couple of days and in these reports. For example, the work that civil society has done on labor migration with a focus on labor rights, decent work, and safe migration, reflecting points 5, 7, and 8 of your 5-year plan, is very much in line with the focus of the government's own work in the Roundtable Workstream 3 on inclusive economic development. It is a fact that when workers' rights are protected, their skills validated, and the recruitment process is ethically sound, all parties stand to benefit. Your concern about ethical recruitment is mirrored in the government's roundtable discussions on ethical recruitment practices with the private sector. We have worked closely with the IOM and the International Organization of Employers to explore how an informal, non-binding ethical recruitment system, known as IRIS, can help governments and recruitment companies protect workers from abuse. IRIS could also help to reduce the space for unscrupulous recruiters to exploit gaps between countries' legal jurisdictions. The discussions you have had on the need for special protection of migrant children and their families, and guaranteeing access to basic services and human rights protection, points 3, 4, and 5 in your 5-year plan, is an area that is also addressed within the context of the government days. A choice to focus on the empowerment of migrants by highlighting policies and procedures that promote migrants' access to legal protection, education, healthcare, indicates to me that civil society and governments are concerned about similar issues, namely the special needs of the most vulnerable, including women and children, and how governments can implement policies that don't violate human rights, even in the cases of undocumented migrants. The third theme of migrants' empowerment is very close to our hearts. Speaking from a Swedish perspective, we cannot underestimate the contributions migrants make to our country. From the global perspective, it's imperative to acknowledge members of the diaspora as transnational development actors. They contribute through skills, jobs, and taxes to their host countries, and many of them are also committed to development in countries of origin or heritage. Not only that, of course, as we've heard, members of the diaspora are often entrepreneurs, creating jobs, trade, and other economic opportunities across borders. Closer to home, the work that we have done with the diaspora within the context of our chairmanship of the Global Forum has resulted in the formation of a new Nordic group on migration and development, which was launched earlier today. There is definitely a need to promote different public images of migration. And who better to do this than members of the diaspora through their own empowerment, and they can articulate their views and influence change. We hope that the work we do with governments within the GFMD can pave the way for policies that support and recognize the value of diaspora contribution to development. I'm excited that our priorities are so closely aligned. In fact, the GFMD has participated in national and regional civil society events throughout the year. As John Bingham said yesterday, we have had common space year-round, not only during the week of the GFMD. By working together, we can align our complementary processes and approaches towards the achievement of a common goal, that mobility is a choice, not a necessity. At the same time, I think we must be humble in the face of people's choices to make personal sacrifices for the sake of their families and the benefit and the belief in a better future. We cannot pass judgment on others, but what can we do But what we can do is to continue to work together in the best way we can to identify policies and practices that do work, that make life better for those who are faced with the choice of whether to go or to stay. In conclusion, that is also why the work we have done together to ensure that migration is included in the post-2015 development agenda is so important. By including migration, we have a chance to implement coherent policies for development that factor in multiple effects of people's mobility into development planning. By acknowledging the reality of migration rather than ignoring it, governments can develop responsive policies that positively impact on people's health, education, and life opportunities. Increasingly, this is understood by governments and the broader international community around the world. It was also recognized by the UN Secretary General when he acknowledged the importance of the GFMD process and called for migration to be included in the post-2015 development agenda at the high-level dialogue in New York last year. This is our joint success and something that we can build on under the Turkish chairmanship of the GFMD. During these 18 months, we have built up momentum together. As 2015 draws closer, now faster than ever, we have to stay focused and work together to advocate for what we believe is right. We have to join forces. Only by standing united on an ambitious, realistic, and balanced approach will we be able to ensure that migration is, in fact, included in the 2015 development agenda. Sweden will remain committed to this process. As we move forward, I draw inspiration from your 5-year, 8-point plan, which remains a concrete roadmap, not only for civil society, but also for governments committed to unlocking the potential of migration for inclusive development. I want to close now by thanking you for these very exciting 2 days and welcome you to the opening of the common space tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your reflections on what you've heard so far from civil society's process and how you also see the two converging, which I think you highlighted in various points, in thematic but also in process, and a number of ways in your input, so thank you for that. We're running a little bit over on time, but we also started late, so I would like to ask if it's possible for you that we continue for another 10 minutes. That means that we'll take a little bit longer for the coffee break, but we'll manage the time, hopefully. So I'd like to ask if there are any questions from the floor, any comments for Eva Åkerman Börje. Once again, the intent is not to rediscuss these thematic issues, but really any reflections. We have about 10 minutes that we can take a little bit of time for that. There are some microphones probably roving around. Yes, right here. Right there. Sorry, the first one is right here in the front. Please also, once again, say your name and your organization.
Ira Dambélé,
French is fine.
Fafra d'économique France.
No, but I have one.
Il y a un mot dans les recommandations qui me gêne, moi, c'est de dire que les diasporas, les migrants ne peuvent pas se substituer aux États, à l'intervention des États. On sait bien que les diasporas, ce que les diasporas revendiquent, ils revendiquent, c'est pourquoi on est là, leur rôle comme acteurs de développement volontaire, ils le font de façon spontanée, mais ils ne sont pas seuls. Les ONG, Caritas, collectent des fonds, les citoyens d'Europe participent aussi au développement, comme les diasporas. Nous sommes des citoyens ici et de là-bas. Donc on le fait de façon vraiment volontaire, ce qui ne peut pas remplacer du tout le rôle des collectivités publiques. Il y a même à demander aux États d'honorer leur engagement pour participer, pour ramener l'aide publique au développement à hauteur de 0,7% du PIB. Ça, c'est quelque chose sur lequel les États sont engagés. Et nous, en France, en tout cas, membres de Coordination Sud, on se bat, Coordination Sud qui est membre du Concorde, on se bat justement pour que les États puissent ramener leur intervention au niveau de 0,7% de leur PIB, ce qui n'est pas le cas pour beaucoup de pays aujourd'hui. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Thank you. We had someone right here in the back and then right over here. Let's take the person who has the microphone over there first.
My name is Tishim Chkambiz. It's more of a comment than a question. I see that most of the groups that have been discussing these issues, it's my observation that there is a neglect of educating the migrants as well in our work in terms of the laws of the countries of destination. Because in most instances, we're talking about protecting the migrants. There is the issue that most of these countries will resist some of our recommendations because some of these migrants will be willfully breaking the laws of those countries in terms of migration control. So it's one of those things that I feel that we should be addressing as well in our advocacy work, that migrants get to be educated on the relevant laws of migration in countries of destination. Thank you.
Thank you. We had right here and Ignacio, and then we'll go here. The lady in the front here with the green dress.
Voilà. Merci beaucoup. Je suis Awa Ndiaye, Espace Afrique International à Genève. Je vais continuer à me faire l'avocate d'un continent. Un continent qui a beaucoup de difficultés à atteindre les objectifs de développement du millénaire. Un continent qui veut s'engager résolument dans l'agenda du post-2015 qui s'appelle l'Afrique. L'Afrique, depuis 10 ans, a dit que sa diaspora doit contribuer de façon effective à son développement. Donc, diaspora 6e région. Et j'aimerais bien, en sortant d'ici, voir s'il y a de grandes lignes directrices pour que cette diaspora africaine réponde aux attentes de l'Union africaine et des États d'origine. Donc, il y a eu un sommet sur la diaspora africaine, 10 ans après, qui s'est tenu en Afrique du Sud, en avril 2012. Et au sortir de ce sommet mondial sur la diaspora africaine, il y a eu tout simplement 4 canevas que les États africains demandent pour que cette diaspora participe. Premièrement, on a parlé des remittances, comme tout le monde. L'OCDE a fait des études. La Banque mondiale, la Banque africaine de développement, etc., etc. Mais comme je l'ai dit hier et ce matin, malheureusement, c'est de l'argent qui ne dort pas dans les banques africaines. Donc, les remittances ne profitent pas actuellement réellement au développement de l'Afrique. Quel est le mécanisme qu'il faut mettre en place pour que les migrants africains soient éduqués? Donc, une éducation financière pour l'utilisation rationnelle et productive de ces flux d'argent. Donc, j'aimerais bien tout simplement qu'à partir de la Suède, qu'un mécanisme puisse se mettre tranquillement en place et que cela se concrétise avec le GFMD à Istanbul l'année prochaine. Et deuxièmement, donc, à part les remittances, les compétences. L'Afrique a besoin des compétences de ces 2e et 3e générations. Comme on le dit souvent, les premiers Africains ont été des balayeurs dans les rues de New York, de Paris, de partout. Mais les 2e, 3e générations, c'est des enfants sortis d'excellentes écoles. Donc, c'est des compétences avérées. Comment faire en sorte que ces compétences, ces savoir-faire, cette technologie, portée par la diaspora africaine hautement qualifiée, puissent prendre le chemin du continent pour aller participer donc, au chantier de développement? J'aimerais qu'il y ait vraiment 2 mécanismes qu'on puisse identifier et poursuivre en tant que diaspora africaine. Je vous remercie.
Merci. I have Ignacio here, then I have one other here. I'm sorry, but we have to limit the inputs that we have because of the time that we're at. So I will take this one here and one in the back, but we will have another session afterwards. Please also be brief. I can say this to Ignacio.
Okay, Ignacio, Parquetaire des Hommes. Thank you. Several of us will be on the common space tomorrow. Michel's shoes are huge, and we're really very proud that you would be chairing and reporting on a lot that has been said here. On the post-2015, I think Colin did a really good job of synthesizing what has been discussed at the PGA and here, over 1,000 minutes of discussion, and there will be 6 minutes in the common space. I have the honor of trying to give honor to all the discussions we've had here. This is the last time we'll be in this kind of setting before it's too late, because next time would be at the end of 2015. So, and I think it's very much as Eva Åkerman said, the common space at the global level is every day is going on, and that has to go down at national level. With all what has been said here, the food, the documents, and so on, no matter the little, perhaps some differences in wording and so on, that has to go at national level, and we have to push, and keep on pushing at national level. You have to have a global, national conversation every day with your government about the points we've been discussing here for post-2015 to come out as we have been working around it here or not too far away. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have one more here, and then we will ask Eva or any of the panelists if they'd like to respond. It was right here.
Thank you, Chair. Frans Bouw on the Hague process on refugees and migration. A very brief but nasty question to Colin in his green room. And I like to mention a little bit maybe a taboo. We are among each other here. Suppose migration will not be put on the agenda of the post-2015 SDG. Do we need already to work on I call it a contingency plan in parallel, so that all the work we do and the energy we use is not going to be lost because we are not going to give up, including with those states, governments, who also have a parallel interest with us? Have you studied this as well?
Okay, why don't we go now to the panel. Colin, since that was a nasty question directed at you, would you like to answer that first? And then I'll move to Eva and the others.
Short answer, yes. Okay. No, sorry. No, I think the whole point of this, as we underlined earlier, two things. One is that not just global, but national agenda. So even if we don't, well, let's take one piece first of all. Even if there is no standalone item in the SDGs related to migration, there are all these different elements, and we're already seeing, at least in the drafts of the OWG, that many things already reflect our parallel, some almost identical to what we're talking about. So we're not too worried they'll be completely missing. What we need to, as Ignacio said, push, is also at the national level. So not just, even if we get it in the SDGs, there's a lot of work over the next 15 years to ensure the implementation, as the sister rightly said. Did the MDGs hit their goals? How was it implemented? There's a lot of questions and concerns about that, and also in terms of the SDGs. We need to work on that as well, but particularly at the national level. So right at the top of the blue document, it says, Migrants and Migration in Post-2015 Global and National Development Agendas. And that's the work we take back. So not just next year's GFMD in Istanbul, but all the way through and beyond over the next 15, 16 years. How do we implement and make sure this is implemented and undertaken by states at the national development agenda level, where the rubber hits the road, so as people say often. But yes, all of it. This is not just a contingency plan. This is the comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Colin. We will also actually be, after our coffee break, look at the post-2015 issue a little bit more in depth. But now I'd just like to ask Eva if she'd have any concluding comments or responses to some of those comments or questions from the floor.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of things that I would like to comment on. The issue of diaspora that came up as also as a question that has been discussed throughout these 2 days. I think it's important to say, and an important message, of course, that I will bring with me, but I would also like to reflect on, let's say, the perspective that is discussed within the Global Forum government side on diaspora. Is, I mean, the starting points are very far from wanting to replace official development funding by remittances, for instance, or there's rather a very strong understanding that remittances are private funds and so on. Mostly the states that bring this issue up, and it's both the sending and the receiving countries, are of course doing it from a perspective that there has so far been a lack of policies that would support the developmental effect of the work that diasporas are doing. So countries of origin, of course, are establishing, we are seeing since some 10 or so years, ministries for diasporas, programs for reaching out to the diaspora. That is slightly ahead of the countries, host countries, that are now looking at how they can develop policies that support the work that diasporas are doing from, let's say, the host countries to their countries of origin. And I really think that there's a surge in understanding of the role that diasporas are playing, and I think that this is some very positive, and we're in the midst of really starting to understand what kind of policies could be helpful in this. I think that there are a lot of other comments to be done on this, but I don't want to prolong it. I just wanted to say also to Colin, because I really thought that was a very intelligent question. So what if we don't get migration into the post-2015 development? God forbid. But we all have to, I mean, I really mean it, and I speak to my colleagues about it also from other countries, that we might have different views on what is the really most important thing. If it's from a migration growth development perspective, or if it's from migrants' rights perspective, or so on. The most important thing now is to join forces, and I think I've heard others say that too. We have to get migration into that post-2015 development agenda. If we don't, the work will not be in vain, because we have come so much longer in the understanding, and we will eventually also get this work onto the agendas of national policies, of the activities in international organizations and so on. So of course the work will not have been in vain, but let's not get to the fallback today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eva, for your frank and honest input, I think, on this process and your reflections, which will also, I think, provide us some food for thought for the next session. I'd also like for us to warmly thank all of the rapporteurs. This is not an easy role. I think it's a challenge to listen to all of the various inputs that we have in the sessions, to put this together in a framework that's very tight, but also to do it in a very tight time frame. So I think we should recognize their efforts. So I would warmly welcome you to have a coffee break. We are running a little bit late, but we'll try to come back here to start at 4 o'clock for the next session.
Yeah, thank you.